The snow fell heavily on the ground, creating a white shield over the valley. The idyllic scene was only shattered by the metallic smell of blood that filled the air. The white fallen snow was covered with scarlet blood and torn off limbs which scattered the ground. Screams could still be heard echoing around the valley. In the soft snow lay a boy, surrounded by a circle of bodies. His skin was blue with cold, and his eyes were tightly shut. The snowflakes melted on his just warm skin as his chest rose at a constant speed. His body didn't seem affected by the icy winds that howled around him. The boy's hair was full of frozen blood, which plastered to his face like a devil's mask. A small cough made his mouth open to reveal a cut lip that streamed blood onto the snow. The ground began to tremble, bringing the boy back into consciousness. 3 soldiers came running towards the carnage, their faces flushed and their swords drawn. They all stopped when they noticed the blood that covered the ground around their feet. The men took off their helmets to show respect to the dead. All were speechless. The boy stayed absolutely still, terrified it could be the beast back to finish off what had started. His eyes darted around, frantically searching for some sort of weapon within his reach. All he could remember was red everywhere, the screams of his father's friends as the monster ripped them apart with a petrifying ruthlessness. "What the hell happened?" the sergeant exclaimed, stepping forward, placing his sword back into its sheath. "We're not sure, sir. One of the villagers stumbled across this." The man gestured to the bodies. "She was hysterical and wouldn't stop screaming. We all thought she was exaggerating." His face went pale as he looked down at the torn-up bodies. The other soldier gagged as the frozen blood stuck to his boots. Without warning, he vomited over one of the figures, his stomach unable to cope with the horrific sight. His hands dug into his stomach, trying to stop his breakfast from reappearing. The sergeant looked disapprovingly at the soldier as the smell of vomit mixed with the already putrid air. He turned away and started to decide what should be done. "Try to identify the bodies. This is a vicious bear attack, and we need to—" The sergeant was interrupted as the boy moaned, turning his white body in the snow. "My God, he's alive!" The other soldiers jumped over the bodies, ripping off his cloak and throwing it over the naked boy. He kneeled down, helping him to sit up, and tightened the cloak over the child. "Mon garçon, what happened?" the sergeant asked. He watched the boy, a look of concern covering his face. The boy sat shivering, his eyes heavy and sore. His throat felt hoarse and tender as he spoke. I do not know, monsieur." He drifted off as his eyes scanned over the bodies laying around him. He brought his legs up to his chest, an icy awareness washing over him. Pairs of glazed eyes stared at him with a look of terror, but only one caught his attention. "Papa!" he screeched. The world seemed to stop as he crawled over to his father. He reached out his blue hand to touch his father's head. The man's face had a look of horror. His mouth was wide open in his last scream of panic. "Mon garçon, we do not want to be out here. The bear could still be around." The boy span around, his bloodshot eyes wide open as his tears created paths in the dried blood. "It was no bear, it was a monster!" the boy yelled at the soldiers, his body shaking with rage and grief. The sergeant stared down at the boy, his big blue eyes reminding him of his son back home. He knew whatever he said to try and comfort him wouldn't be enough. Offering a hand, he bent down, giving the boy's shoulder a comforting squeeze. "Then we shall find this monster, and we will kill it." The sergeant smiled and regarded the child as an equal, as someone who did not deserve this memory. The edge of the boy's mouth made a slight curve, but he was reluctant to take the man's hand, so he stood up on his own, his legs shaking. He tightened the cloak around himself. The adrenaline was fading, and the cold was beginning to bite at his bare chest. The vomiting soldier stood up, his hands around his waist and his pale cheeks only just returning to a healthy pink. He looked sympathetically at the child. He swallowed, trying to remove the bile that filled his mouth, feeling pathetic at his weakness. A raven came to settle on the bodies, its black eyes staring like the devil at the boy, its jet black beak peeking at the exposed muscle. All of a sudden, the boy doubled over in pain. "Ah!" He screamed, his hands grabbing at his stomach, tearing at the skin. It felt like fire traveling throughout his veins. "Mon garçon, what's wrong?" The sergeant placed a gloved hand on his back. "Get off of me!" The boy shrugged him off, waving his hands hysterically in the air. He began to breathe heavily, a wheezing sound erupting from his lungs. His eyes stared at the ground, a look of true realization and fear surging through him. Without warning, he sprinted for the forest, his bare feet pounding against the forgiving snow. The sergeant grabbed for him, but only took a hold of fabric, and the boy raced off into the darkness. Not wanting to leave the boy alone, he followed, drawing his sword in case the bear reappeared. The branches slammed the sergeant in the face, cutting the delicate skin under his eyes and around his neck. The snow began to fall heavily again, drifting through the canopies of the trees and settling on the man's head and obscuring his view. The boy was only just in sight, and at any second he could lose him in the dull light. He pumped his legs faster, but the heavy armor slowed him down, and the boy vanished. The sergeant came to an abrupt halt, and he screamed for the boy to come back. When only his echo answered, he slammed his sword into the tree beside him. A howl pierced the air, the eerie sound sent fear down his spine. He stopped hacking the tree and brought his sword in front of him. The forest was still, and all he could hear was the wind as it wailed through the trees. He gulped, his breath becoming ragged. His eyes skimmed the darkness, searching for where the sound had come from. Before he could turn back, a deep growl emerged from the trees. Two red eyes appeared in the sergeant's view. A massive black head reared up. The monster towered above him, and all he could do was look on in terror. His sword clattered to the ground, and he screamed as the monster leapt at his throat. 20 years later, a thick fog covered the road, obscuring the way ahead. A black carriage appeared out of the haze, its 4 horses moving at high speed, their breath creating a vapor around their noses. The driver held onto the long reins with gloved hands, his huge black coat covering his entire body, keeping out the cold air. As the horses approached the forest, they slowed down, reluctant to enter. They began to pound their hooves, the horses at the front shaking their heads and backing up into the other 2. The driver whipped the reins, urging them forward, but he was met with stone statues that would not move. "Why have we stopped?" a male voice yelled from inside the carriage. "It's nothing, sir," Pascal muffled. He jumped down, rubbing his arms and pulling his hood further over his head. He smacked the horse's haunch, but still got no response. He sighed and ran his hand along the horse's body as he walked around to its head. "Come on, boy," he whispered into the horse's ear. The animal's eyes darted around in the dark, scared stiff at the monster that lurked in the darkness. Pascal turned around, trying to see what the horse was looking at. All he could see was the road ahead. He pulled at the horse's bridle and led him onwards. The large hooves echoed in the gloomy night, adding an eeriness to the air around the carriage. Pascal shivered and bent his head around to look back at the forest. He felt as though something was watching his every move. But as he felt the horses picking up on his nerves, he shook it off and put it down to an overactive imagination. He had been the driver for the Novakek family for over 10 years, and he had never failed to arrive on time. He then led the horses further into the forest until he was certain they would carry on without him. He hurried to the steps that took him back to his seat. When he heard a twig snap, this time he was sure it wasn't his mind playing tricks. He unclenched his hand from around the metal rail and headed towards the sound. He stared intensely into the woods, certain there was something lurking in the mist. "Hello?" His gruff voice leaving an echo in the air. There was no reply, so he turned back, convinced it was now his tiredness playing tricks on him. Annabelle watched Pascal as he strolled over to the forest, his small, beady eyes glancing out from underneath his facial hair and hood. He carefully made his way over to the edge of the road and seemed to stand there for a while staring at the darkness. "Annabelle," her father grumbled, his blanket draped over his bony legs, keeping out the cold. "Yes, father," she replied, her mind elsewhere. "Do you remember everything I have told you?" "Yes, father." She watched as Pascal seemed to yell out into the nothingness, his gloved hands rubbing together. He then came back to the carriage and jumped back up, rocking the compartment. "The Baron of Blois has a passion for Moraine's horse, which he breeds on his land. He enjoys dances." "Belle, are you listening to me?" "Yes, father." The carriage began to move again, but much slower than before. But the trees still merged together in a black mesh of trunks. Belle was terrified about what to expect. At the occasional social dance, she would hear rumors about the Baron of Blois. He was meant to be a placid man with huge wealth. His father had recently passed away, leaving him with a substantial inheritance. Belle couldn't comprehend why he had chosen her as his wife. She was nothing special, unlike her sisters. "Belle, this is important," her father wheezed, his fingers rolling his gold ring around his thumb. "Yes, father," she replied, still not listening to him. Her father's eyes watched his daughter scan the scenes passing by, a feeling of dread creeping into his stomach. "Annabelle!" he shouted, making her gasp at his raised voice. "Sorry, Papa." She leaned forward and placed a delicate hand on his knee. He sighed and rubbed his temple with his thumb and forefinger. "Belle, our financial problems have not become apparent yet, but as soon as it does, it will be impossible to marry you. The scandal will be impossible to damper. Your sisters are happily married. My problems will affect them, but you, I do not want you to be a spinster left to care for me in my old age." His tired, gray eyes pleaded with her heartstrings. He leaned back into the seat. His frame seemed to shrink as his dull eyes turned to stare out of the small window. Over just a few years, his work had taken a turn for the worse, and now it was straining on the old man. His eyes had begun to sink into his skull, and his once plump physique had shrunk down into an almost skeleton build. "I know, Papa. I'm sorry. My mind has been elsewhere. It's like a dream come true." Belle said what her father wanted to hear. She hated seeing him so weak, and she didn't want to break his heart as well. She was worried about who her new husband was. Belle wasn't like her perfect sisters. Adele with her flawless golden hair and bright blue eyes. Alicia with her chiseled features and brown curly locks. People said she was a mixture of the two, but whenever she looked in a mirror, she would see a dull brunette with uninteresting blue eyes. A howl pierced the silence that lay between her and her father. "Papa, what was that?" she said, swinging her leg around to look out of the window. "Probably just a stray dog." He gestured with his hand, but didn't sound convinced. He tightened his hand around his sword. He slammed his fist against the wall of the carriage, urging the driver to speed up. The horses began to whinny and rear with fear, which made the carriage halt and jerk to the side. Belle grabbed onto the seat to steady herself. Her father pulled out his sword, but it was shaky in his wrinkled hand. "Papa!" Belle screeched as she noticed the fear in her father's eyes. "Stay here, Belle." Her father pushed open the door and walked out into the night. A growl vibrated Belle's gut, and she cowered into the corner, her breath staggered. Ripping sounds mixed with the horse's shrieks and a man's scream filled the air. "Run!" the driver yelled before a gurgling sound erupted from his torn throat. Annabelle leapt out of the carriage in time to see her father raise his sword in defiance of a monster. Its red eyes glowed like the ambers of hell, and huge teeth protruded from its humongous jaw. It dived at her, but was stopped by her father, who threw himself into its jaw. She screamed as the monster sank its teeth into her father's shoulder. The thing jerked its head at an unnatural speed to look at her with those evil eyes. Its mouth was covered in the blood of her father and Pascal. It growled at Belle and began to move towards her, its huge clawed feet scraping against the hard ground. She fled. Her feet pounded against the frozen earth. Losing her shoes, the uneven ground scarred her bare feet. She headed for the trees, not turning to look if the monster had followed her. The fog clung to her body and obscured her vision. She ran blind into the forest, hearing her heart pounding in her throat. Running for what felt like hours, the adrenaline pumped around her body, giving her the strength to carry on. Her foot snagged in a root, leaving her sprawled across the forest ground. She lay there for a moment still and shocked. She listened to the silent woodland. A tear fell from her eye as the memory of her father's dead body appeared before her eyes. Her body gave in to her tiredness, and she didn't move, just letting her grief win. Then she remembered her father's bravery, as he sacrificed himself for her. She screamed into the ground and pushed herself up. She stumbled through the darkness, searching for any sign of humanity. But for hours she walked in circles, disorientated. Her brown hair was a mess of tangles and twigs. Her face had a cut that was bleeding down her cheek. The sun was peeping through the trees. A blue haze seemed to settle over Belle's world. She hugged herself, shivering and scared. Belle slipped as her feet scraped against a rough surface. She breathed a sigh of relief and sat on the ground. Before long, she heard the sound of horses' hooves. "Help me, please." Her voice was weak, but to her it sounded like thunder. The horse galloped around the corner. The man who rode it wore a tricorn hat, which sent a shadow over his face. He slowed down and came to a stop next to Belle. He jumped down and put a hand on her shoulder. "Mademoiselle." His voice was soft, and Belle felt herself relax into his arms. He helped her up, taking off his jacket to place it over her. Before he could continue to inquire about her state, Belle felt her eyes close, and the blackness overtook her. She fell into the gentleman's arms, the exhaustion too much to bear. Belle's head rested on the man's leg, her long brown hair a mess covering his knee. He stroked her face, moving the hair away from her delicate features. He peered down at her as he carefully placed his arms under her knees, picking her up from the cold ground. He looked unstrained as he placed Belle over his horse. Then he jumped in front of her and trotted back the way he had come.